The Opium War is usually told as a story about British arrogance, about an empire forcing drugs on a civilization that doesn't want them. And that's not wrong. It's just not the most interesting part. The interesting part is Britain didn't go to war just because it was powerful and cruel. It went to war because it was trapped. Its entire financial position in Asia depended on silver flowing in one direction, and China was trying desperately to change it. Two empires, two systems, very incompatible requirements, and one very powerful navy. Here's how it actually worked. To understand why the Opium War happened, you have to start somewhere most history books don't. Not in a British trading house, not in a Qing palace, but in a field. Because the thing that started to make this inevitable was happening at the ground level years before a shot was ever fired. China's land tax system was ancient, and it had one structural quirk that would eventually become catastrophic. Taxes were assessed and collected in silver taels, but the ordinary worker was paid in copper cash. This wasn't a problem so long as the copper and silver exchange rate stayed roughly the same. In Shanxi province in 1758, 730 copper cash would buy you a single silver tael. Manageable. By the 1820s, it had climbed to 1,000 to 1. By 1845, it was 1,600 to 1 in some provinces. And in places like Shanxi, it climbed as high as 1,800 to 1. But what did this mean in reality? A farmer in the 1830s was now paying the same silver tax bill that his grandfather did. But in real copper terms, he's now paying twice as much as his grandfather ever did, all for the same plot of land, being paid to the same dynasty. The only thing that's changed is the exchange rate. It's just that silver had got a lot more expensive, and he couldn't afford to buy or earn any more silver. The consequences for the farmer are almost automatic. No one's really thought this through. If you're a small landholder or a middling family, you're potentially forced to give up your land, your home, your only way of living, or you're forced into being an indentured labourer. Not great. These weren't people who failed. They just got caught up in a currency mismatch that they had no way of getting out of. China's crisis wasn't caused by bad harvests, lazy farmers, or corrupt officials, although there was some of that. It was caused by silver draining out of the economy faster than it could ever be replaced. The silver that was disappearing from Chinese villages, it wasn't just evaporating. It was moving halfway across the world to solve a different silver crisis and a whole different set of economic pressures. Britain in the late 1700s had a problem it didn't like to admit out loud. It was losing money in China. Badly. And the more it traded, the worse the problem got. The East India Company was buying enormous amounts of Chinese silk, tea, and porcelain, products that British consumers were going absolutely mad for back home. The problem is what China wanted in return. Basically nothing that Britain made. In a famous event where British envoys spoke to the Chinese emperor, were told in no uncertain terms that they didn't want what the British were selling. And they weren't entirely wrong. British wool was completely useless in more tropical environments. Cheap manufactured British goods couldn't compete with craft-produced Chinese wares. So Britain paid in silver, consistently, for decades. Between 1752 and 1800, around 105 million silver dollars flowed into China from the West. At the same time as all this is happening, the East India Company is trying to service an enormous debt. A debt that's come from having to start conquering India. In this time, that debt sat at £28 million. Not a small sum in those days. And the combined output from India and China going through the company mounted to just £2 million per year, barely making a dent. This wasn't a temporary imbalance. It was structural. China produced goods that the whole world wanted, including Britain. But Britain didn't offer much that China wanted. And the gap between what the two sides could offer each other was being plugged by silver. Silver that Britain couldn't afford to keep sending to China. The question wasn't really whether Britain would try and fix this problem. The question was really how and when. And here's where the two sides start to converge. Because the solution Britain eventually found for its silver problem turned China's small squeeze of silver into a hemorrhage. Britain needed to reverse the flow of silver. China needed to keep it going in the direction it was going. Those two facts couldn't really coexist. And what happened next wasn't so much a decision as a collision between decisions that had already been made. Britain needed something China would buy. Not just buy compulsively, regularly, in quantities large enough to reverse a decades-long silver deficit. It turns out there's exactly one product that meets that description. Opium wasn't new to China. It'd been used in medicine for centuries. But what changed as a result of the British decision was the scale and the method of taking it. The opium from British-controlled Bengal was smoked rather than eaten, and a lot more addictive than what had come before it. And by coincidence, the British East India Company had a complete monopoly on the production of opium in its region. But it didn't want to get its hands dirty by directly trading it into China. That would be too obvious, too unseemly for something that was an arm of the British state. It auctioned the drug to private merchants, who would then run it into China, giving them plausible deniability that it was anything to do with them. They just sold it to merchants. What they did with it was their problem. But of course, they're collecting the revenue. They're collecting the silver. And we have some numbers that tell the story very clearly. Around 1800, around 4,000 chests of opium a year are entering China. By 1831, that was nearly 20,000. By 1839, it had topped 40,000 per year. That's a tenfold increase in less than 40 years. And crucially, Chinese buyers were paying for this in silver. The economic reversal was total. As we've seen, between 1752 and 1800, 105 million silver dollars are flowing into China. Between 1808 and 1856, approximately 308 million silver dollars are flowing out of China. This is the mechanism that's causing the villages to be drained of silver, that's stopping the farmers being able to pay their taxes. That means their land's being confiscated, that they're being forced to work for free for somebody else. Not bad governance, not on its own anyway. Not a natural disaster, a deliberate structured trade in a product designed to be addictive and have repeat customers, sold in the one currency that everyone needed. Charles Eliot, the British superintendent in China, in 1837 he wrote about possible interruptions to the trade and what effect that would have, crippling our means of purchasing in this market. Not being able to purchase in this market meant no tea, it meant no porcelain. It meant none of the goods that the British really wanted. Lord Palmerston put it even more clearly. Britain could pay for some of the goods in goods that it offered itself, but the rest had to be paid, the majority had to be paid, in silver and opium. They're not looking at it from a moral point of view. They're just seeing balance sheets. They're just seeing their economy, inputs and outputs. So the opium trade wasn't a crime of passion. Britain had a structural deficit, and opium fixed it. The fact that fixing it required draining an economy of the silver it needed and caused farmers to not be able to pay their tax bills was somebody else's problem. And this is the point where the two systems start to meet face to face. The Chinese farmer who needs silver to pay his tax bill, and the British trader who needs that same silver to head towards the British Isles. Here's the question that sounds simple, but it isn't. If the opium trade was destroying China's silver supply, and the Qing government knew it, and they did know it, they had been debating doing something about it for years, why didn't they do something to stop it? The Qing government banned opium imports several times. The bans existed mostly on paper. They just didn't work. Part of this was obviously corruption. Those traders interacting with the East India Company, they're paying huge bribes to local officials to make sure the goods get to where they need to get to make sure they get the silver they need. But the deeper problem was completely structural. The opium trade was profitable for everyone involved in the supply chain. Smugglers, middlemen, local merchants, corrupt officials. Everyone in this network had an incentive to keep it going. The people with the least power to change anything, those farmers, had the least power to change anything. And then a hero comes along with the strength to carry on. In 1839, Lin Zhu is sent to Guangzhou to sort the problem out once and for all. That's his mandate. And he did something remarkable that actually worked, at least locally. He confiscated 20,283 chests of opium from British merchants, worth roughly £2 million, or somewhere between 6 and 10 million silver dollars. He had them destroyed, thrown into the sea. And the British response was to send gunships that made one thing very clear. If they wanted to enforce this trade, they would and they could. And here we can see the blocked feedback loop in action. The Chinese Empire tries to correct course, stop silver flowing out of their country, stop people getting addicted to opium. That correction directly threatens British merchants' ability to balance their accounts. Britain escalates to military force. The correction fails. The Qing state wasn't weak because it was incompetent. It was weak because the one correction it could make, the only one that would move the dial enough to really save them, was one that another military power, far stronger than them, had a direct financial interest in making sure never came to pass. In one of the more remarkable documents from the 19th century, Lin Zhu, the guy who threw the opium into the sea, wrote a letter to Queen Victoria herself. He appealed to her moral sense, whether she would allow opium to be sold to British subjects. He pointed out the obvious hypocrisy. He never received a reply. In fact, the letter probably never reached her, but a response was on its way, in the form of a navy expedition. The war that followed has been called many things: a clash of civilizations, a defense of free trade, a moral outrage. But regardless of your opinion, I know what mine is. If you strip away the language for a minute, we see two systems defending themselves against correction. The First Opium War lasted from 1839 to 1842. Britain won decisively. And in some ways, the peace treaty, the Treaty of Nanking, tells us everything we need to know about the British reasons for the war in the first place. Britain didn't demand an apology. It didn't demand that China adopt its values, its systems. It demanded Hong Kong, 5 other treaty ports open to British trade, and crucially, £21 million in reparations. And specifically, 6 million of that was for what Zhu Xu threw into the sea. 2 million worth of opium, 6 million in compensation. China was made to pay for the drugs that were confiscating its silver. Is it just me, or is that wild? At the outset of war in 1839, a British text had already made clear how important this trade was to them. The reversal of the balance of trade in Britain's favour contributed directly to support the vast fabric of British dominion in the East, and benefited Britain by £6 million annually, without impoverishing India. That's a quotation. Yeah, it wasn't impoverishing India. Those costs were being felt elsewhere, in China, by farmers who couldn't afford to pay their tax bills, who were losing their land, their way of life, their ancestry. Back in Hunan, back in Shanxi, the exchange rate kept climbing. The silver kept slipping away. Tax collectors kept turning people away. The war alone didn't create this situation, but it did confirm the direction of travel. And here's where the inevitability kicks in, that makes this whole story make sense without necessarily needing a villain, although there are plenty of those people in here. Once Britain's Indian empire depended on opium revenue to balance its China trade, and China's whole economy depended on silver inflows, a clash was always inevitable. The survival of one needed the destruction of the other, and the side with the bigger navy got to decide which one survived. The farmer in Hunan didn't necessarily lose his land because someone decided he had to. He lost it because he was the pressure valve in a system that was created by two empires, and neither of them did anything to reduce the pressure on the ordinary man. People like Lin Zhu tried to fight back, and when the war was a total disaster, people just like him were thrown under the bus by their own side. Over the centuries, there have been hundreds, maybe thousands of people who have done the thing that their side wanted or needed them to do. But when the moment was convenient, they were blamed for everything. Fighting back against an unstoppable force, all in the name of saving your country. Watch this to see how Joan of Arc went from peasant girl to hero to someone that was thrown under the bus the second they didn't need her anymore. Bye.